Harlan County, Kentucky, March 7, 1934. 22 minutes past 4 in the morning. Roy Hensley had been underground for 16 years. He was 38 years old, and he carried those years in the way coal miners carry them, in the lean around the shoulders, in the particular way his eyes adjusted to dark faster than any man on his crew, in the habit of touching the wall with the back of his hand before leaning against it. He had started in the seams at 22, the same age his father had started, and the Hensley men had an understanding with underground spaces that required no language. Roy was the shift foreman on the Blackwell No. 4. He knew the mine the way a man knows a house he has lived in for a decade. Which timbers creaked, which faces ran wet, which shafts held temperature, and which bled it. On the morning of March 7, 1934, he was leading his crew through the eastern extension of Level 8, the deepest working face in the mine, 411 feet below the surface of Harlan County, because the face had been giving good coal all week and he expected it to give good coal today. He was the first one through the breach. The crew had been blasting the face in sections, and the morning charge had brought down a clean drop of new material. Standard practice at the Blackwell was to wait 20 minutes after a blast before the crew went in. Enough time for the dust and gas to settle, enough time to read the roof. Roy went in at 4:22 and stopped at the edge of the new face, and what stopped him was not something he saw, it was what he did not see. The new face had opened onto something, not another seam, not a gas pocket, a space. He raised his lamp and the light went in and did not come back from any wall. He stood at the edge of that space for 4 seconds. He counted them. He was a man who counted things by habit, feet of face, tons of coal, minutes of gas exposure, and he counted the 4 seconds it took him to understand that the blast had opened a chamber that was not a natural formation. He called his crew and they came in and they stood beside him and none of them spoke. But here is what the Harlan County Bureau of Mines has spent 90 years making sure you never ask about. The Blackwell No. 4 operated under the ownership of the Consolidated Eastern Coal Corporation, headquartered in Lexington, Kentucky, and incorporated in 1921. On March 7, 1934, the mine employed 182 men across 3 shifts. It had been in continuous operation since 1908 and had never, in 26 years, failed to report a shift's production. The morning of March 7th was the first time a production report was not filed. The Kentucky Department of Mines and Minerals received no report from Blackwell No. 4 for March 7th, March 8th, or March 9th. The explanation recorded in the department's administrative log, a document held at the Kentucky State Archives under the designation Mining Records, Series 4, Volume 12, was a single line. Operation suspended. Ventilation inspection. The ventilation inspection, if one occurred, was never submitted in the form required by statute. The eastern Kentucky coal fields of 1934 were among the most contested industrial terrain in the United States. The National Miners Union had been organizing in Harlan County since 1931, and the county had earned the name Bloody Harlan for the frequency with which labor disputes ended in violence. Mine owners employed private deputies, maintained blacklists, and operated with a degree of legal autonomy that federal observers had documented extensively in congressional testimony that same year before the Senate Civil Liberties Committee. Into this landscape, in the 4th year of the Depression, came men who worked for wages cut twice in 18 months, and who understood that their continued employment depended on their willingness to work without asking questions. Roy Hensley was not a man who asked questions. He had not been for 16 years, until the morning of March 7th. The chamber was roughly circular. Roy estimated the diameter at 60 feet, though the measurement he committed to was 48 feet, because 48 was the number he could verify from the entry point to the far wall using reference points he could hold in his lamp's reach simultaneously. The floor was cut stone, not natural limestone, but shaped blocks fitted together without mortar, the joins so tight his fingernail could not find the seam. The ceiling was 8 feet above the floor and arched in a way that required intentional shaping. The walls were smooth to a height of 5 feet and rough above that, the roughness not random but scored. Systematic parallel marks running at a consistent angle that Roy could not explain as anything natural. In the center of the chamber, arranged in a circle on the cut stone floor, were 14 figures. They were not standing, they were seated. Each facing the center of the circle, each positioned at an equal distance from a central stone that rose from the floor to a height of approximately 3 feet and was flat on top. Roy Hensley described this stone, in the account he gave 3 weeks later to a reporter from the Harlan Daily Enterprise named Carl Bowman, as an altar. He used that word and then immediately said he did not know why he used it. But that was the word that came. The figures were skeletal. They were complete, no scattered bones, no disarticulation, no evidence of disturbance. 14 complete human skeletons seated in a circle, each upright, each facing center, each with the hands positioned in the lap in a way that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than the collapse of a body over time. Roy counted them twice. 14 was the number both times. What Roy estimated on the morning of March 7th, and what 5 of his crew corroborated in separate accounts to Carl Bowman, was that the smallest of the 14 figures measured 9 feet from the base of the pelvis to the top of the skull. He arrived at this estimate by comparison to the ceiling, 8 feet, which he had measured, and by the observation that all 14 figures, seated, had their skulls above the 8-foot mark. The tallest, which Roy placed in the northeast quarter of the circle, had a skull that cleared the ceiling mark by what he estimated as 4 feet, meaning a seated figure whose skull reached 12 feet from the floor, a standing height he placed at no less than 15 feet. There was no source of light in the chamber. Roy's lamp was the only light. The darkness was the particular darkness of a sealed space, not the ordinary darkness of a mine passage that connects to other passages and carries residual light from sources further along, but the total darkness of a room with no openings. No openings other than the one the blast had made. No air circulation. The air in the chamber did not move. Mine air always moves. There is always some pressure differential, always some current. The air in the chamber was still. It smelled, Roy said, like a room that had been sealed before there was anyone alive to seal it. The crew stayed in the chamber for 11 minutes. Roy pulled them out at 4:33 and sent his lamp boy, a 19-year-old named Daniel Pruitt, up to surface to bring the mine superintendent, a man named George Whitaker. Then Roy went back in and sat at the entry and looked at the 14 figures in the lamplight and did not touch anything. He had been underground long enough to know that the value of what you find is measured by what you leave undisturbed. George Whitaker arrived at level 8, stood at the center of the chamber for 3 minutes without speaking, and told Roy to seal the entry with temporary timber and to say nothing to anyone until he came back. He was gone from the mine by 6 o'clock. He came back at 9:30 with 2 men Roy had not seen before, suits, both of them, one carrying a leather case of the kind Roy associated with doctors or lawyers. They went into the chamber and were in there for 2 hours. Roy was not permitted to accompany them. When they came out, the man with the leather case carried it with both hands. The other man spoke to Whitaker for 4 minutes. Then both men left. Whitaker told Roy that the Level 8 Eastern Extension was being closed for structural assessment. He said it with the tone of a man who had been told what to say and was saying it. Roy had worked for Whitaker for 7 years and knew the difference between Whitaker forming a thought and Whitaker delivering a message. This was the latter. The crew that sealed the chamber did not include any member of Roy's shift. They came in on the night of March 8th. 6 surface workers who had no business being 411 feet underground, brought concrete and timber and worked through the night. By the morning of March 9th, the entry was sealed. The wall of the eastern extension of Level 8 looked as though the blast of March 7th had never happened. The Harlan Daily Enterprise carried a 4-paragraph account of the discovery on March 9, 1934, under Carl Bowman's byline. It described a chamber containing skeletal remains of unusual dimensions, mentioned the circular arrangement and the stone altar, and named Roy Hensley and George Whitaker. The edition of March 10th carried no follow-up. Bowman left the paper in April 1934. A review of his subsequent career through Kentucky Press Association records, held at the University of Kentucky Special Collections, shows brief employment at two other papers before December 1934, after which he does not appear in any professional record. He was 31 years old. Bowman's pre-publication notes, described to his nephew William Bowman in a letter dated 1971, contained three details that did not appear in the published account. First, the seated figures had no grave goods, no weapons, no tools, no associated objects of any kind. Second, the stone altar had markings on its upper surface, not carved but pressed, as though something had rested there long enough to leave a depression in the shape of a rectangular object, approximately 18 inches by 12 inches. Third, one of the two men who arrived with Whitaker at 9:30 identified himself to Whitaker, within Roy's hearing, as a representative of the Bureau of American Ethnology. The Bureau of American Ethnology's field records for March 1934, held in the Federal Archives under that institution's administrative series, contain no entry for any field visit to Harlan County in that month or in the 2 months preceding or following it. A Freedom of Information request filed in 2018 by the independent researcher Donald Ferris, requesting all travel records for Bureau personnel to Kentucky for the period 1930 through 1940, received a partial response. Records for January and February 1934 were provided. The March records were withheld under Exemption 3 of the Freedom of Information Act, which covers materials exempted from disclosure by separate statute. The statute cited was not identified in the response. The exemption does not legally apply to travel vouchers under the administrative records provisions of Title V of the United States Code. The Consolidated Eastern Coal Corporation suspended operations at Blackwell No. 4 on April 2, 1934, citing exhausted seams. The eastern extension of Level 8, which the company's own geological survey from 1933 projected as the most productive section of the mine for 3 to 5 additional years, was listed in the closure filing as played out. The closure was processed by the Kentucky Department of Mines and Minerals in less than 6 hours, against a standard review period of 3 to 5 business days. The approval was signed by the Deputy Commissioner, a man named Franklin Heath, who left state employment 2 months later to take a position with a federal contractor based in Arlington, Virginia. The physical characteristics of the finds establish a set of parameters that existing archaeological frameworks for eastern Kentucky cannot accommodate. 14 skeletal figures at a minimum of 9 feet seated height, in a sealed chamber with cut stone construction at a depth of 411 feet, in a geological layer whose deposition the Kentucky Geological Survey's 1931 report estimated at no less than 8,000 years before present. These parameters do not describe a burial practice of any known culture in the Ohio Valley or the broader Appalachian region. The Adena culture, which represents the most sophisticated mound-building tradition in eastern Kentucky, reached a maximum documented period of activity from approximately 900 BC to 200 BC. Adena construction did not include cut stone. Adena burials did not occur at depths approaching 400 feet. Adena skeletal remains, documented in hundreds of excavated sites across Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia, do not record individual heights exceeding 6.5 feet. A skeletal figure whose seated skull clears an 8-foot ceiling mark is not an outlier. It is a different category of physical existence. The stone construction technique Roy described, fitted blocks without mortar, joins tight enough to resist a fingernail, appears in one North American context with any consistency. The pre-Inca construction tradition of the Andean highlands, specifically the dry stone masonry associated with the Tiwanaku culture of the Bolivian plateau, dating from approximately 500 AD to 1100 AD. The parallel is not culturally specific. The parallel is technical. The same stone fitting method appears in two geographically separated contexts, one acknowledged in the archaeological record and one sealed behind concrete in Harlan County. The Blackwell No. 4 property, 480 acres in the southeastern quadrant of Harlan County, was acquired in September 1934 by the Cumberland Land Management Corporation, registered in the state of Delaware in August 1934, 1 month before the acquisition. The registered agent was a Wilmington law firm that served as registered agent for 47 other limited liability companies in the same period. The Cumberland Land Management Corporation has no employees, no commercial activity, and no tax filings indicating revenue of any kind in the 90 years since its incorporation. The property taxes on 480 acres of Harlan County have been paid without interruption since 1934. The current entry point is a steel gate installed in 2019. A camera is mounted on the gate post, its housing newer than the steel it watches over. There is one other account that connects directly to what left the chamber on the morning of March 9, 1934. His name was Earl Combs, and he was 64 years old when he gave it, in an interview recorded in October 1960 by a folklorist from the University of Kentucky named Margaret Colton, who was documenting coal camp oral history in Harlan County. The interview is archived at the King Library at the University of Kentucky. Earl Combs had worked the surface operation at Blackwell No. 4 from 1928 through the closure, and he was one of the 6 surface workers brought in on the night of March 8 to seal the chamber. He said the concrete was pre-mixed and brought on a truck from outside the county. The plates were not Kentucky plates, and the driver did not speak to any of the mine workers. The work was lit by portable generators that came on the same truck. He said the foreman of the sealing crew was not anyone he recognized from the mine operation, and that the foreman spoke with an accent he identified as not being from the South, not meaning from the North, but that the foreman's English sounded like the English of someone for whom English was not the first language. He could not be more specific than that. He said that before the concrete was poured, 2 men from the truck went into the chamber and came out carrying something between them, holding it by handles on the long sides. He described the object as roughly the size of a large trunk. The surface was not wood. The sound it made when the men set it down briefly near the entry, a flat, dense sound, not hollow, was the sound of something very heavy and solid. He said he never told anyone this until Margaret Colton asked him. He had not spoken about it, not because he was afraid, though he acknowledged that in 1934 a man in Harlan County, who caused difficulty for a mine operator, had reason to be afraid, but because he had concluded on the morning of March 9th that there was nothing useful to be done with what he knew. He had watched the thing come out of the chamber and go on to the truck and the truck leave in the direction of Pineville. And he had gone home and eaten breakfast and slept and never gone back to Blackwell No. 4. Because the mine was closed and he had found other work, and the other work was enough. Margaret Colton's interview notes from October 1960 include one line she added in her own hand at the bottom of the transcript page. Entirely credible, no motivation to fabricate, account internally consistent with other oral sources from Blackwell closure period. She did not publish the interview. It appears in the archived collection alongside several others she also chose not to publish, without explanation. She retired from the University of Kentucky in 1971 and died in 1984. Roy Hensley transferred out of Harlan County in the spring of 1934, 3 weeks after the mine closure. His name appears in the 1940 federal census in Bell County, Kentucky, listed as a coal mining laborer, not a foreman. He had been a foreman for 7 years. He died in 1962. His obituary in the Middlesboro Daily News describes him as a retired coal miner, a member of the First Baptist Church, a man known to his family as quiet and private. It does not mention Harlan County. It does not mention March 7, 1934. It does not mention the chamber. Roy Hensley was 38 years old on the morning of March 7, 1934. His lamp was the first light to enter the chamber in however long the chamber had been sealed. He stood at the breach, and he looked at the 14 figures in their circle, and he counted them twice, and then he counted the seconds, 4 of them, and then he called his crew. He had spent 16 years trusting the predictability of stone. On that morning, the stone gave him something he had no category for, and he handled it the way he handled everything underground, carefully, without panic, noting the measurements, preserving what could be preserved. The chamber is still there, 411 feet below the surface of Harlan County, behind the concrete wall poured on the night of March 8, 1934. The 14 figures are still seated in their circle. The altar is still at the center. The depression on its upper surface, rectangular 18 by 12 inches, is still there. The 14 are still in the position Roy Hensley found them, facing the center of the circle, in a darkness they have occupied since before anyone alive can measure. The physical characteristics of the chamber require a comparative framework that the official archaeological record for eastern Kentucky does not provide, because the official record declines to acknowledge that the chamber existed. Cut stone floor construction at 411 feet below the surface of Harlan County, shaped blocks, fitted without mortar, joins tight enough to resist a fingernail, places the chamber outside every documented North American construction tradition without exception. The Mississippian culture, whose platform mound tradition represents the most architecturally sophisticated pre-Columbian construction in the eastern United States, produced surface-level earthwork and timber construction. The Hopewell Network, whose exchange system connected populations across thousands of miles of the Ohio Valley, produced burial mounds with prepared clay floors. Neither tradition cut stone. Neither tradition worked at depths approaching 400 feet. Neither tradition produced chambers whose ceiling was intentionally arched to a height of 8 feet. The chamber at level 8 of the Blackwell No. 4 is not an outlier within any known tradition. It is outside the boundary of all known traditions simultaneously. The closest architectural parallel in the Western Hemisphere is not from eastern Kentucky or from any part of North America. It is from the pre-Inca sites of coastal Peru, specifically from the subterranean chambers associated with the Chavin de Huantar complex in the Andean highlands, which show cut stone construction at depth with arched ceilings and sealed interior spaces designed for specific ritual use. Spaces that, like the Harlan County chamber, show fitted stone with no mortar and a floor precision that modern engineers have measured at tolerances of less than a millimeter. The Chavin complex dates to approximately 900 to 200 BC. The geological layer in which the Harlan County chamber was cut, the layer whose deposition the Kentucky Geological Survey's 1931 report estimated at no less than 8,000 years before present, predates the Chavin complex by a minimum of 6,000 years. The parallel is architectural, not cultural. The same construction standard appears in 2 geographically separated contexts at different dates, both of them outside the standard framework for their respective regions. One of them is accessible and studied. The other is behind concrete in Harlan County. The Adena skeletal record, which represents the most thoroughly documented pre-Columbian human remains from eastern Kentucky, shows maximum individual heights of 6.5 feet across hundreds of excavated sites. The gap between 6.5 feet and 9 feet is not a matter of statistical variation at the population extremes. It is a categorical gap. A 9-foot seated figure, meaning a standing figure of at least 12 feet, does not represent the tall end of an Adena population distribution. It represents a different population. The Adena people and the figures in the Harlan County chamber did not share a demographic continuum. They shared a geographic region separated by thousands of years and a physical scale separated by factors that no known process of human variation produces. The chamber contained what it contained. Roy Hensley counted them twice. 14 was the number both times. The 5 crew members who corroborated Roy Hensley's account in separate statements to Carl Bowman between March 7 and March 20, 1934, were working miners in Harlan County during one of the most economically desperate periods in the county's history. They had every practical reason to stay quiet about something that might cost them their employment, and no practical reason to fabricate or exaggerate an account that exposed them to professional risk. Their accounts were given to a journalist, not to law enforcement, or to any institution that could reward or threaten them. Their corroboration was consistent on the core physical facts: the circular arrangement, the cut stone floor, the skeletal dimensions, and varied only in peripheral details that indicated independent observation rather than coordinated testimony. 5 independent witnesses in 1934 agreeing on the dimensions of seated figures whose skulls cleared an 8-foot ceiling is not a statistical event that coincidence explains. It is a description of what was in the chamber. The chamber has been sealed since March 9, 1934. 90 years of concrete and timber backfill have held the entry closed through the settlement and shifting of a worked mine at 411 feet. The Blackwell No. 4 mine property has been in the custody of the Cumberland Land Management Corporation since September 1934, and the Cumberland Land Management Corporation has done nothing with 480 acres of Harlan County coal country in 90 years except pay the property taxes and maintain the steel gate on the county road access. The timber stands above it in second-growth forest. The ground surface shows no feature, no depression, no marker. The 14 figures are below all of it, still seated in their circle around the altar, in the position Roy Hensley found them at 4:22 in the morning on March 7, 1934, in a darkness that has been unbroken since before the concrete was poured. The altar is at the center. The depression on its upper surface is still there. Whatever rested in that depression for however long it rested there was carried out on the morning of March 9th by men who did not leave a receipt. The 14 are still there. They have been there for longer than the 8,000 years that the Kentucky Geological Survey estimated as the minimum age of the geological layer that enclosed them, and they will be there for whatever additional time passes before someone files a Freedom of Information request whose exemption the responding institution cannot legally sustain.